My name is Maria, and the hardest walk I ever took was the one leading away from a dinner table where there was no chair for me. I was told I was an outsider, a stranger who had to pay a price just to be acknowledged. For a long time, I believed them. But tonight, I want to tell you the story of how I stopped begging for a place in their world and started building my own. To everyone watching who feels like they are fighting a losing battle, you are not invisible to us. Here at Mother's Story, we share the pain so we don't have to carry it alone. Please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support tells every outsider that they finally belong somewhere. The fluorescent lights of the office usually hum with a rhythm I find comforting, a steady vibration that mirrors the predictable nature of my spreadsheets and reports. But lately, even that small sanctuary has begun to feel like a cage. By the time the clock strikes 5, my bones feel as though they are made of lead, heavy with the exhaustion of a day spent performing a role that is slowly eroding my soul. I am Maria, a woman who once believed that love was a fortress, a sacred space where the world's cruelty could not reach. I used to walk home with a lightness in my step, eager to reach the apartment I share with Alan, thinking of it as our haven. Now, every step toward that front door feels like a march toward a battlefield where I am the only one unarmed. The evening air was biting as I walked home today, the wind whispering through the trees like a warning I wasn't quite ready to heed. I thought of Alan, and for a fleeting moment, a warmth spread through my chest. I remember the way he looked at me on our wedding day, as if I were the only fixed point in a spinning universe. He is a good man, or at least, I tell myself that every night as I lie awake staring at the ceiling. He has a kindness that is soft and yielding, a trait I once adored but now find myself drowning in. His love is a gentle flame, yet it offers no heat against the glacial chill that his mother, Anna, brings into our lives. I find myself mourning the woman I was before I became the outsider, the girl who laughed without looking over her shoulder, the girl who didn't know that a home could be haunted by the living. As I reached our building, I paused at the entrance, my hand hovering over the cold metal of the handle. I closed my eyes and prayed for silence. I prayed for the simple grace of an empty living room and the smell of a home that belonged only to us. But as I climbed the stairs, the familiar dread began to coil in my stomach, a cold serpent tightening its grip with every step. I stood outside my own door, fumbling for my keys, only to hear the faint, unmistakable sound of a voice from within. My heart didn't race, it simply sank, a heavy stone dropping into a dark well. The click of the lock as I turned my key felt like a betrayal. I stepped inside, and the air immediately changed. It wasn't the scent of the lavender candles I had lit this morning, it was the sharp, clinical smell of bleach and the heavy, cloying perfume that Anna wears, a scent that always seems to herald the death of my peace. There she was, standing in the center of my kitchen, a dishcloth in her hand like a weapon. She didn't look up at first. She simply continued to wipe a counter that I had scrubbed until my fingers were raw before I left for work. The silence between us was not peaceful. It was a living, breathing thing, thick with all the words she used to diminish me. She has a way of moving through my home as if she is the rightful owner and I am merely a squatter she is too polite to evict. I watched her hand move, the same hand that had held the spare key Alan gave her without consulting me. That key is a symbol of every boundary blurred, every private moment violated. It represents the fact that in this marriage, there are 3 of us, and I am the one standing on the periphery. She finally turned to look at me, her eyes sweeping over my tired frame with a clinical detachment that made me feel small. She didn't offer a greeting. Instead, she sighed, a long, theatrical sound that carried the weight of 1,000 disappointments. She pointed a thin finger toward the stove, where a pot of soup I had prepared the night before sat cold. Her voice was soft, masked in a veneer of motherly concern that felt like shards of glass wrapped in silk. She spoke of the saltiness, the lack of nutrition, the way a real wife would prioritize her husband's health over her own career. Every word was a tiny needle, pricking at the edges of my confidence until I felt the familiar sting of tears behind my eyes. I didn't cry, though. I haven't let her see me cry in a long time. I have learned that my tears are merely nourishment for her disdain. I moved to the bedroom to find Alan, hoping for a shield, a word of defense, or even just a look of shared frustration. He was sitting on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands, looking every bit as weary as I felt. When he looked up, I saw the man I loved, but I also saw the boy who could never say no to the woman in the kitchen. I wanted to scream. I wanted to ask him why my dignity was a price he was willing to pay for his mother's approval. I wanted to tell him that every time he allows her to enter our home unannounced, a brick is removed from the foundation of our life together. But the words died in my throat. How many times have we had this conversation? How many times has he told me that she is just being a mom, that she means well, and that I should try to be more understanding? The tragedy of my life is not that I am hated by my mother-in-law, it is that I am being erased by my husband's silence. It is a slow, agonizing disappearance. I see it in the way I no longer buy the things I like because she will criticize them. I see it in the way I stop singing in the shower because I am afraid she might be standing in the hallway, listening for a reason to judge me. I am becoming a ghost in my own hallways, a shadow that retreats whenever the sun, her son's loyalty, shines too brightly on her. Tonight, as the three of us sat at the dinner table, the atmosphere was suffocating. Anna spoke of Alan's childhood, of a time before I existed, weaving a narrative where she was the sun and he was the only planet in her orbit. She looked at me only to point out a speck of dust on the sideboard or to comment on how my work must be so taxing since I clearly didn't have the energy to keep a proper house. Alan ate in silence, his eyes fixed on his plate, a silent accomplice to my humiliation. I looked at him, searching for the man who promised to protect me, but all I found was a stranger who looked like my husband. The most heartbreaking part is the love I still carry for him. It is a bruised and battered thing, but it persists, making the pain of his betrayal even sharper. If I didn't love him, I could leave. If I didn't love him, her words wouldn't cut so deep. But I do. I love the way his hair falls over his forehead when he's focused. I love the way he used to hold my hand under the table. And that love is the anchor that keeps me trapped in this storm. I am a woman who is working herself to the bone to provide for a future that is being dismantled piece by the woman sitting across from me. As the night wore on and Anna finally prepared to leave, she patted my cheek with a cold, dry hand. It wasn't an affectionate gesture, it was a mark of ownership. She told me to try harder tomorrow, to be the wife Alan deserves. When the door finally clicked shut behind her, the silence that followed was even more painful than her voice. Alan reached out to touch my shoulder, but I flinched. The touch that used to bring me comfort now felt like a reminder of everything he failed to do. I walked to the window and watched her small figure walk away down the street. She looked so fragile from a distance, so harmless. But I knew the truth. She is the thorn that has grown deep into the heart of my marriage, and I am the one bleeding out. I leaned my forehead against the cool glass, watching the city lights blur through a veil of unshed tears. I am Maria, and I am losing myself in a home that was supposed to be mine. I am a stranger in my own life, waiting for a dawn that feels like it may never come. I would like to tell you that this was just one bad day, but it is the map of my existence. It is a cycle of intrusion and indifference, a slow-motion car crash that I am forced to watch from the driver's seat. As I finally lay down to sleep, turning my back to the man who is supposed to be my partner, I felt a hollow ache in my chest that no amount of sleep could heal. The thorn is there, sharp and unforgiving, and tonight, I am too tired to fight the pain anymore. The silence in our house has a texture now. It is heavy and rough, like wool that scratches against the skin, irritating and inescapable. It is the sound of things unsaid, of pleas swallowed whole, and of a loneliness so profound that it echoes in the empty spaces between us. I used to believe that the worst feeling in a marriage was anger, the fiery, explosive shouting matches that leave scars. But I was wrong. The worst feeling is screaming at the top of your lungs while the person standing right in front of you acts as if they cannot hear a sound. It is the slow, suffocating realization that your voice no longer carries any weight, that your pain is invisible to the one person who promised to cherish you. This morning, the isolation bled outside the walls of our apartment. I walked to the local market, a routine that used to bring me a small measure of peace. I liked the smell of fresh bread and the colorful disarray of the fruit stands. But today, the air felt different. As I passed Mrs. Higgins, a neighbor who used to greet me with a warm smile and inquiries about my work, she turned her head sharply away. It was a deliberate, cutting motion. I saw her whisper something to the woman beside her, their eyes darting toward me with a mixture of pity and judgment. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, a burning shame for a crime I hadn't committed. It wasn't just Mrs. Higgins, it was the cashier at the grocery store, the man walking his dog, the collective gaze of a neighborhood that had suddenly turned cold. I knew the source of this chill. It was Anna. Her influence was like a gas, odorless and invisible, seeping under doors and through cracks until it poisoned everything it touched. She had been busy, I realized. While I was at work, trying to build a future for us, she was weaving a tapestry of lies about me. I could almost hear her voice, dripping with faux sorrow, telling anyone who would listen how lazy her daughter-in-law was, how I neglected her precious son, how I was ungrateful for her help. She painted herself as the martyr and me as the villain, and because she wore the mask of a sweet, elderly woman, they believed her. I was the outsider, the working woman with no time for domestic perfection, and she was the devoted mother. The injustice of it sat in my throat like a stone, making it hard to swallow, hard to breathe. When I returned home, the sanctuary of our apartment felt more like a cell. I unpacked the groceries with trembling hands, the image of the neighbor's averted eyes burning in my mind. I needed to talk to Alan. I needed him to see what was happening, to understand that his mother wasn't just difficult, she was actively dismantling my life. I rehearsed the words in my head, arranging them carefully like fragile glass figurines, terrified that one wrong move would shatter them. I cooked his favorite meal, a desperate, pathetic attempt to soften the blow, to buy a moment of his attention with the currency of domestic servitude. When Alan finally walked through the door, the exhaustion on his face made my heart ache. I wanted to comfort him, to wrap my arms around him and forget the world outside. But the poison was already in the room. He kissed my forehead, a gesture that felt mechanical, a muscle memory devoid of passion. We ate in a silence that was punctuated only by the scrape of cutlery against china. Every time I looked at him, I saw the ghost of the man I married, fading behind a wall of indifference. Alan, I began, my voice sounding thin and foreign to my own ears. We need to talk about your mother. The change in him was instantaneous. His shoulders stiffened, and he let out a sigh that sounded like the air escaping from a punctured tire. He didn't look up from his plate. He didn't need to. I knew that look. It was the look of a man who had already decided that whatever I was about to say was an inconvenience he didn't want to deal with. Maria, please, he muttered, cutting a piece of steak with unnecessary force. I've had a long day. Can we not do this tonight? I can't just ignore it anymore, I pleaded, the desperation leaking into my tone. She's telling the neighbors terrible things about me, Alan. Mrs. Higgins wouldn't even look at me today. She's spreading lies, saying I don't feed you, that I'm cruel to her. It's humiliating. I feel like a pariah in my own neighborhood. He finally looked up, but there was no spark of outrage in his eyes, no protective fire. Instead, there was a dull, glazed look of annoyance. He looked at me as if I were a child complaining about a scraped knee. You're overreacting, Maria, he said, his voice calm and reasonable, which only made the knife twist deeper. Mom just likes to talk. She's old, she's lonely. She doesn't mean any harm. You know how people are, they gossip. It doesn't mean anything. It means something to me. I cried, my hands gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles turned white. It affects how people treat me. It affects how I feel walking out that door. Why can't you see that she's doing this on purpose? She wants to isolate me. She comes in here, criticizes everything I do, and then goes out and plays the victim. It's cruel, Alan. He shook his head, a small, condescending smile playing on his lips. Cruel? My mother? Maria, she loves us. She brings us food. She cleans when you're too busy with work. Maybe she's a bit old-fashioned, sure, but cruel? That's a strong word. I think you're just being too sensitive again. You've always been a bit fragile about these things. Too sensitive. The phrase hung in the air between us, a verdict that dismissed my entire reality. It was a label he used to shut down any conversation that required him to confront the uncomfortable truth about his mother. By calling me sensitive, he didn't have to be brave. He didn't have to choose me. He could remain the dutiful son, comfortable in his denial, while I drowned in the toxicity he refused to acknowledge. I am not being sensitive, I whispered, tears finally spilling over, hot and humiliating. I am being bullied. And the man who is supposed to protect me is watching it happen and telling me it's my imagination. Alan pushed his chair back, the screech of wood against the floor sounding like a scream. He stood up, looking down at me with an expression of disappointment. I'm not going to argue about this, he said firmly. She's my mother. She raised me. I know her heart. She would never hurt you intentionally. If you just tried harder to get along with her, if you weren't so defensive all the time, maybe things would be different. Have you ever thought about that? Maybe the problem isn't her. Maybe it's you. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow. I sat there, paralyzed, as he turned his back on me and walked into the living room, turning on the television to drown out the sound of my weeping. The flicker of the blue light cast long, dancing shadows on the wall, ghostly figures that seemed to mock my solitude. He didn't see the woman who loved him. He didn't see the wife who was trying to hold their world together. All he saw was an obstacle to his peace, a nagging voice that dared to tarnish the pristine image of the woman who gave him birth. He was blind, not because he couldn't see, but because he refused to look. To see my pain would be to admit his mother's cruelty, and that was a reality his world could not support. Later that night, as I lay in bed next to him, the distance between us felt vast, an ocean of cold, dark water. He was asleep within minutes, his breathing steady and untroubled. I lay awake, staring into the darkness, feeling the crushing weight of my own insignificance. I reached out a hand, hovering it inches above his back, longing for a connection that was no longer there. I wanted to shake him awake, to scream, to make him understand that I was drowning. But I knew it was useless. His ears were deaf to my cries. His heart was a fortress I could no longer breach. I realized then, with a terrifying clarity, that I was alone in this marriage. I was sleeping next to a stranger who would watch me bleed and tell me that the blood wasn't real. The tears flowed silently into my pillow, dampening the fabric, absorbing the grief of a love that was slowly dying of neglect. The rift was no longer a crack, it was a chasm, and I was standing on the edge, looking down into the abyss, wondering how long I could keep from falling. The loneliness was a physical ache, a hollowing out of my chest. I thought of the neighbors' whispers, and a smirk, and Alan's back turned against me. I was surrounded by people, yet I had never felt more singular, more erased. The night stretched on, endless and unforgiving, and I lay there, a statue of sorrow, waiting for a morning that would bring no relief. The seasons changed outside my window, the trees shedding their leaves in a silent surrender to the approaching cold, mirroring the slow stripping away of my own resilience. But then, unexpectedly, a shift in the wind occurred, a sudden, warm gust that promised a thaw. It happened on a Tuesday, an unremarkable day that would become etched in my memory as the moment I dared to hope again. Alan came home early, his face flushed not with the usual weariness, but with an excitement I hadn't seen in years. He practically vibrated with it, a boyish energy that made him look younger, lighter. "I got it, Maria," he exclaimed, dropping his briefcase with a reckless abandon that made me jump. "The promotion. The senior project manager role. They gave it to me." For a heartbeat, I just stared at him, my mind struggling to process the joy radiating from him. Then, a smile broke through my guarded expression, genuine and bright. I rushed to him, throwing my arms around his neck, breathing in the scent of his cologne and the faint, metallic tang of the city that clung to his coat. "Alan, that's amazing. I knew you could do it. I'm so proud of you." He laughed, a sound that felt like music after months of silence, and spun me around. It comes with a raise, Maria. A significant one. We can finally do things differently. Those words hung in the air, shimmering with possibility. Do things differently. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic bird seeking escape. This was it. This was the lifeline I had been praying for. With this new income, we didn't have to stay in this cramped apartment, suffocating under the weight of Anna's proximity. We could leave. We could go somewhere where the air was cleaner, where the streets were lined with parks instead of judgmental neighbors, where our front door didn't feel like a revolving gate for his mother. Later that evening, as we sat over a celebratory dinner, takeout from our favorite Italian place, eaten straight from the cartons with a bottle of wine between us, I broached the subject. I tried to keep my voice casual, to mask the desperate longing that clawed at my throat. You know, I started, swirling the dark red liquid in my glass, with this new salary, and maybe thinking about the future, about a family, this apartment is getting a bit small, isn't it? Alan looked up, his mouth full of pasta, and nodded slowly. Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. It's not exactly ideal for kids, is it? No, I agreed, my pulse quickening. And there are those lovely towns just an hour north. Greendale, maybe? They have great schools, parks, and it's so much safer. Plus, the commute wouldn't be too bad with the express train. I held my breath, waiting for the inevitable defense of his mother, the refusal to leave her orbit. But to my shock, Alan's eyes lit up. Greendale, that actually sounds nice. I've heard good things. And you're right, if we want kids, we need space. A backyard, maybe. Tears pricked my eyes, but this time, they were tears of relief. He saw it too. He saw a future that included us, a family unit separate from the stifling grasp of his mother. A backyard, I whispered, the image blooming in my mind, a patch of green grass, a swing set, a place where our children could play without fear of criticism or intrusion. That sounds perfect, Alan. Let's do it, he said, reaching across the table to take my hand. His grip was firm, reassuring. Let's start looking this weekend. It's time for a change. That night, as I lay in bed, the crushing weight that had sat on my chest for so long seemed to lift. I imagined a house with a white picket fence, a kitchen that smelled of baking bread instead of Anna's harsh perfumes, a living room where we could laugh without looking over our shoulders. I imagined a life where I was the woman of the house, not an interloper. I imagined Alan standing beside me, a true partner, his loyalty finally anchored to me and our future children. For the first time in months, I slept deeply, my dreams filled with sunlight and the sound of children's laughter. The next few days were a blur of joyous planning. I scoured real estate listings during my lunch breaks, circling charming cottages and spacious townhouses in red ink. I felt a renewed energy at work, a lightness that made even the most tedious tasks bearable. I was building a raft, and soon, we would sail away from this island of misery. I started to pack small things in my mind, books, winter clothes, the fragile hope that had begun to take root in my heart. I didn't tell anyone yet, superstitious that speaking it aloud might break the spell. But I hummed as I cooked, I smiled at the neighbors who still shunned me, thinking, soon, I won't have to care what you think. I was invincible. Thursday evening, Alan came home with a bouquet of lilies, my favorite. He kissed me deeply, lingering in a way he hadn't in ages. I found a place, he said, his eyes shining. A colonial in Greendale. 4 bedrooms, a huge yard, and it's within our budget. The agent is sending over the details tomorrow. I felt like I was floating. It was really happening. The nightmare was ending. Oh, Alan, I breathed, burying my face in the flowers, their sweet fragrance filling my senses. I can't believe it. We're really going to be happy. We are, he promised, stroking my hair. I want us to be happy, Maria. I know it's been hard lately. I know. Mom can be a lot. But this move, it's a fresh start. For both of us. His acknowledgement of the difficulty, however slight, felt like a balm to my wounded soul. He did see. He did care. I clung to him, feeling the solid warmth of his body, and allowed myself to believe that the man I married had returned to me. The walls of our apartment, once a prison, now felt temporary, like a hotel room we were about to check out of. But hope, I would soon learn, is a treacherous thing. It lifts you up only to drop you from a greater height. It blinds you with its brilliance, making the shadows seem less daunting, less real. I was so dazzled by the prospect of our new life that I failed to see the storm gathering on the horizon. I failed to realize that some roots go too deep to be severed by a simple change of address. The weekend approached, and with it, the promise of viewing our potential dream home. I spent Friday evening organizing our finances, dreaming of paint colors and nursery themes. I was happy. Truly, deeply happy. I didn't know then that happiness in this house was a borrowed thing, a loan that would be called in with interest. The phone rang just as we were finishing dinner. The shrill sound cut through our laughter, jarring and insistent. Alan glanced at the screen, and I saw a flicker of hesitation cross his face before he answered. Hello? Hi, Mom. My stomach tightened. The air in the room seemed to cool instantly. I watched him, trying to decipher the conversation from his one-sided responses. Oh, really? That sounds okay. Yeah. No, we're free. Okay. See you then. He hung up and looked at me, the light in his eyes dimming slightly. That was Mom, he said, his voice carefully neutral. She wants to take us out for dinner tomorrow night. To celebrate the promotion. Tomorrow? I asked, trying to keep the disappointment out of my voice. But we were going to look at the house listings. We can do that in the morning, he assured me, though his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. It's just dinner, Maria. She sounded happy. Excited, even. She said she's found a really nice place. It would mean a lot to her. I swallowed the lump of dread forming in my throat. I didn't want to see her. Not now, when everything was going so well. But I nodded, forcing a smile for Alan's sake. Okay. Just dinner. Just dinner, he repeated, squeezing my hand. If only I had known. If only I had seen the trap for what it was. But I was drunk on hope, blinded by the illusion of a new beginning. I didn't see the spider waiting in the center of the web, patiently spinning the silk that would soon strangle the life out of my dreams. The fragile bubble of hope Alan and I had inflated over the last few days didn't burst with a bang, it withered, slowly and painfully, the moment the doorbell rang on Saturday afternoon. It was a sharp, intrusive sound that sliced through the quiet intimacy of our living room, where real estate brochures were spread out like maps to a promised land. I knew who it was before I even stood up. There is a specific cadence to the way Anna presses a doorbell, insistent, demanding, a summons rather than a request. My stomach turned over, a heavy stone of dread dropping into the pit of my belly, replacing the fluttering excitement that had lived there since Alan's promotion. When I opened the door, Anna stood there, framed by the hallway light like a specter of judgment. She was dressed immaculately, as always, in a stiff, tailored suit that seemed to repel dust and warmth alike. Her hair was coiffed into a helmet of gray steel, not a strand out of place, and her lips were painted a shade of red that looked too much like a warning. She didn't wait for an invitation. She simply stepped past me, her gaze sweeping over the apartment with that familiar, stinging critique. She noted the scattered brochures on the coffee table, her eyes narrowing slightly, but she said nothing about them. Instead, she turned her attention to Alan, her face transforming instantly from cold appraisal to adoring warmth. The performance had begun. She didn't hug me. She barely acknowledged my existence, treating me like a piece of furniture that had been regrettably placed in her path. Her focus was entirely on her son. She gushed over his success, her voice pitching high and sweet, praising his intelligence, his hard work, his inheritance of her own tenacity. I stood by the door, closing it softly, feeling the familiar sensation of shrinking. In her presence, I always felt my edges blurring, my substance fading until I was nothing more than a ghost haunting the periphery of their bond. But then, the script changed. Anna turned to me, and for the first time in years, her smile didn't look like a grimace. It was stretched tight, yes, and it didn't reach her cold, calculating eyes, but it was there. It was a terrifying expression, like a predator baring its teeth in a mockery of friendliness. She announced that she wanted to take us out. Not just to the local diner or for a quick coffee, but to the Gilded Lily, the most exclusive, exorbitantly expensive restaurant in the city. It was a place reserved for anniversaries of the wealthy, a place I had only ever admired from the street, knowing its velvet ropes were not meant for people like me. She spoke of the reservation as if it were a royal decree, a magnanimous gift that we were expected to accept with bowed heads and gratitude. She described the menu, the ambience, the prestige, her words weaving a golden cage around us. My internal alarm bells were deafening. Anna was a woman who counted every penny when it came to me. She had once gifted me a regifted scarf for Christmas while buying Alan a designer watch. This extravagance was out of character, a dissonance that made the hair on the back of my arms stand up. Why now? Why this sudden, grand gesture? I looked for the trap, scanning her face for the flicker of malice that usually accompanied her interactions with me, but she was hiding it well behind a mask of maternal pride. I tried to decline. I tried to use the excuse of our busy schedule, of the house hunting we had planned, of the fatigue from the work week. I spoke the words softly, trying not to ignite the fuse of her temper, but she waved my concerns away with a dismissive flick of her manicured hand. She wasn't asking me, she was telling me. And then, she played her trump card. It wasn't just us, she explained, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. It was the whole family. Caroline and her husband, the eldest brother. Smith and her husband, the youngest. Everyone was coming. It was a family celebration, she emphasized, the word family landing with a heavy thud that explicitly excluded me while demanding my attendance. If I didn't go, I would be the only one missing. I would be the difficult one, the ungrateful wife who couldn't set aside her petty grievances for one night to honor her husband. I looked at Alan, silently begging him to intervene, to see the manipulation for what it was. I wanted him to remember the brochures on the table, the dream of Greendale, the promise of a life where we didn't have to dance to his mother's tune. But when I met his eyes, I saw the light of our shared rebellion extinguishing. He looked at his mother with a mixture of guilt and longing, the eternal child seeking approval. He saw a peace offering where I saw a snare. He turned to me, and his voice was a betrayal. He didn't command me, which might have been easier to resist. Instead, he pleaded. He asked me to do it for him. He told me it would mean so much to have everyone together, that maybe his mother was finally trying, that this could be the fresh start we needed before the move. He framed it as a bridge being built, blind to the fact that I was the one expected to lay myself down as the foundation. The pressure was suffocating. The air in the room felt thin, sucked dry by the weight of their combined expectation. If I said no, I was the villain. If I said yes, I was the victim. There was no winning, only different degrees of losing. I looked at Anna, who was watching me with a smug patience, knowing she had already won. She knew exactly which buttons to press to make Alan fold, and she knew that I loved him too much to let him stand alone. So, I surrendered. I nodded, a small, defeated motion that felt like signing away a piece of my soul. I agreed to the dinner. I agreed to the charade. Anna didn't stay long after that. Having secured her victory, she had no use for further conversation. She breezed out of the apartment with a final instruction about the dress code, formal. Maria tried to look the part, leaving a trail of her cloying perfume in her wake. The silence she left behind was not peaceful, it was heavy with things unsaid. Alan was relieved. He hugged me, thanking me for being reasonable, for making an effort. He didn't see the way my hands trembled as I packed away the real estate brochures. He didn't understand that by agreeing to this dinner, I felt as though I was stepping back into the shadow we had just started to escape. He went to the shower, humming a tune, his optimism restored by his mother's hollow gesture. I remained in the living room, staring at the closed door. A profound sadness settled over me, a cold fog that seeped into my bones. I felt a deep, instinctive fear that this dinner was not a celebration, but a reckoning. I thought of Caroline and Smith, the other wives. We were not friends. Anna made sure to keep us separated, pitting us against each other in a silent competition for her scant approval, but I knew they suffered too. We were a sorority of the miserable, bound by the same ring of fire. That night, as I prepared my outfit, I felt like a soldier donning armor for a battle I was destined to lose. I chose a simple, elegant navy dress, one that I loved, but as I held it against my body in the mirror, it felt like a costume. I wasn't dressing for a celebration, I was dressing for an execution. I looked at my reflection, the tired eyes, the set jaw, the posture of a woman bracing for impact, and I didn't recognize myself. I was no longer the hopeful wife planning a new life in the suburbs. I was the outsider, the intruder, the stranger Anna always accused me of being. I lay in bed that night, listening to Alan's steady breathing, feeling miles apart from him in the same bed. The dread in my stomach had solidified into a cold, hard knot. I couldn't shake the feeling that the gilded lily was a trap, that the invitation was poisoned. But I had swallowed the bait, and now, there was nothing to do but wait for the poison to take effect. I closed my eyes, but sleep didn't come. Instead, I saw Anna's smile, that terrifying, triumphant smile, and I knew, with a chilling certainty, that tomorrow night would change everything. I just didn't know yet how much I would lose, or how much I would finally have to find within myself to survive it. The darkness of the room felt absolute, a preview of the emotional blackout I feared was coming. I whispered a silent prayer to a universe that hadn't been listening lately, let me be wrong. Please, just let me be wrong. But in the silence of the apartment, the only answer was the steady ticking of the clock, counting down the minutes to the disaster awaiting us at the table set for a family that didn't include me. The morning of the dinner arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum, heavy and low, pressing down on the city as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. I woke up not with the anticipation of a celebration, but with the hollow, aching dread of a woman walking toward her own execution. Beside me, Alan slept with the peaceful ignorance of a child, his chest rising and falling in a rhythm that used to lull me to sleep but now only served as a metronome counting down the seconds to the end of our life as we knew it. I lay there for a long time, tracing the cracks in the ceiling with my eyes, trying to locate the exact moment when my marriage had transformed from a partnership into a battlefield. It wasn't a sudden explosion, I realized. It was a slow erosion, 1,000 tiny surrenders where I had swallowed my pride, my voice, and my dignity to keep the peace. But peace, I had learned the hard way, was just another word for my silence. And tonight, the silence had to end. There was a humming in my veins, a frantic, vibrating warning that I could no longer ignore. It was the instinct of a prey animal sensing the trap before the steel jaws snapped shut. Anna didn't do kindness. She didn't do expensive dinners or family reconciliations. She dealt in power, in humiliation, and in the surgical dismantling of my self-worth. If she was gathering us all together at the Gilded Lily, it wasn't to toast Alan's success, it was to orchestrate a spectacle. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that I was intended to be the entertainment. I got out of bed, my movements mechanical, and went into the living room. On the small table by the door sat a package that had arrived yesterday. I stared at it for a moment, feeling a wave of nausea. Inside was a small, sleek digital voice recorder. I had ordered it in a fit of desperation, a tangible acknowledgement that my word meant nothing in this family. For years, I had told Alan about the snide comments, the insults whispered when he left the room, the way his mother looked at me like I was a stain on her pristine life. And for years, he had looked at me with those sad, puppy dog eyes and told me I was imagining things. She's just old-fashioned, he would say. You're reading too much into it. I opened the box, my fingers trembling as I held the cold, black device. It felt heavy, heavier than its plastic shell should allow, weighted down by the tragedy of its necessity. I was a wife preparing to spy on her own family dinner just to prove that I wasn't insane. It felt like a betrayal, a dirty secret that coated my hands in grime. But as I tested the button, click, record, click, stop, I felt a strange, grim resolve harden in my chest. This was my shield. If tonight went the way I feared, if Anna unleashed her venom and Alan once again chose blindness over his wife, I would have proof. Not for him, he was likely beyond saving, but for me. To remind myself, when the gaslighting started, that the cruelty was real. As I held that recorder, I made a vow to the woman in the mirror, the ghost of the vibrant girl I used to be. It was a silent ultimatum, a line drawn in the sand of my soul. If she attacks me tonight, and if he does not stand up for me, I am leaving. The thought didn't come with anger, it came with a sorrow so profound it felt like mourning. I was grieving a marriage that hadn't even ended yet. I was preparing to amputate a limb to save the body. I loved Alan. God, I loved him so much it hurt. But I could not survive being his mother's punching bag for one more day. I could not live in a house where my pain was treated as an inconvenience. The day passed in a blur of anxiety. I moved through the apartment like a phantom, packing a small bag with essentials and hiding it deep in the back of the closet, just in case. Every time I looked at Alan, happily whistling as he ironed his best shirt, my heart fractured a little more. He was so excited. He talked about the menu, about seeing his brothers, about how this promotion was going to change everything. He didn't see that he was walking into a lion's den, dragging his wife behind him on a leash of obligation. I wanted to shake him, to scream at him to wake up, but I knew it was useless. He had been conditioned since birth to crave her approval, and tonight, he thought he was finally getting it. When it was time to get ready, I went into the bathroom and locked the door. I stared at my reflection, noting the dark circles under my eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. I applied my makeup like war paint, layering on a mask of composure. I chose a dress that made me feel dignified, a simple, elegant black sheath, but as I zipped it up, it felt less like evening wear and more like a shroud. I slipped the voice recorder into my clutch, checking 3 times to make sure the red light was covered but the microphone was unobstructed. It sat there against my lipstick and keys, a technological grenade waiting to be pulled. "Ready, babe?" Alan called from the hallway, his voice bright and eager. I took a deep breath, inhaling the scent of my own fear, and forced a smile onto my face before opening the door. "Ready," I lied. The car ride to the restaurant was torture. Alan filled the silence with nervous chatter, talking about the wine list and the history of the Gilded Lily. I stared out the window, watching the city lights smear into long, glowing streaks against the glass. Every mile marker we passed felt like a step closer to the gallows. I gripped my clutch so tightly my knuckles turned white, the hard edge of the recorder pressing against my palm, a constant reminder of the precipice I was standing on. "You're quiet tonight," Alan noted as we stopped at a red light, his hand reaching over to cover mine. His touch was warm, familiar, and it made me want to weep. "Just tired," I whispered, pulling my hand away gently under the guise of adjusting my dress. I couldn't bear his touch right now. It felt like a promise he wasn't going to keep. We pulled up to the restaurant, and it was everything Anna had described, imposing, opulent, and utterly intimidating. The building loomed over the street like a cathedral of wealth, its golden lights spilling onto the pavement, illuminating the expensive cars and the valet attendants rushing back and forth. It was a place designed to make you feel small, to remind you of your place in the hierarchy of the world. It was Anna's natural habitat. As I stepped out of the car, the cool night air hit my face, but it did nothing to settle the turmoil in my stomach. My legs felt weak, as if the bones had turned to water. I smoothed down my dress, my hand brushing against the hidden recorder one last time. Click. I turned it on. The tiny red light would be blinking in the darkness of my bag, a silent witness to whatever was about to happen. I looked up at the ornate entrance, the heavy wooden doors that seemed to guard the secrets of the elite. I felt a profound sense of loneliness wash over me. I was walking in with my husband, but I had never felt more single. I was entering this arena alone, armed only with a plastic device and a broken heart. "Come on, Maria," Alan said, offering me his arm. He looked handsome in the dim light, his face open and hopeful. "Let's go celebrate." I took his arm, feeling the muscle beneath the fabric of his suit. I wondered if this was the last time I would hold him like this. I wondered if, an hour from now, we would be enemies. The sadness was a physical weight in my chest, a stone that made it hard to breathe. I wasn't walking toward a celebration, I was walking toward the truth. And the truth, I feared, was going to destroy us. "Okay," I breathed, the word barely a whisper. "Let's go." We walked toward the golden doors, the sound of our footsteps lost in the murmur of the city. I squared my shoulders, lifting my chin in a defiance I didn't truly feel. I was terrified. I was heartbroken. But I was also ready. If tonight was the end, I would meet it with my eyes open. I would not be the victim anymore. I was the witness, the judge, and if necessary, the executioner of my own marriage. I stepped across the threshold, into the golden glow of the trap, and waited for the jaws to snap. The restaurant was a cathedral of opulence, a place where the air itself seemed gilded, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the quiet murmur of people who had never worried about the price of anything. Crystal chandeliers dripped from the ceiling like frozen tears, casting a kaleidoscope of light over tables draped in linen so white it hurt the eyes. I felt a familiar shrinking sensation as we followed the maitre d', my heels sinking slightly into the plush carpet, each step taking me further away from the safety of my own life and deeper into Anna's domain. Alan's hand was warm on the small of my back, a gesture of possession and support that usually grounded me. But tonight, it felt like a brand, marking me as his, and therefore, hers. We wove through the maze of tables, past diners who glanced up with mild disinterest, until we reached a private alcove at the back. And there they were, the family. Anna sat at the head of the table like a queen on her throne, flanked by Alan's brothers and their wives, Caroline and Smith. They were already drinking wine, their laughter a tight, brittle sound that shattered the moment we arrived. "Alan! You made it!" Anna's voice rang out, sweet as syrup but laced with something sharper. She stood up to embrace her son, ignoring me completely as she pulled him into a hug that looked more like a stranglehold. I stood awkwardly to the side, a smile plastered on my face that felt like a crack in a porcelain mask. "Hello, Anna," I said, my voice sounding small in the cavernous room. She didn't answer. She didn't even look at me. She simply gestured to the empty chairs. "Sit, sit. We've been waiting." I moved toward the table, scanning the arrangement. There were 6 people already seated. There was one empty chair next to Anna, clearly saved for Alan. My eyes darted around the table, counting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 chairs. 7 people. There was no chair for me. A cold flush crept up my neck, burning my ears. I stood there, frozen, as Alan took his seat next to his mother, oblivious. He turned to me, smiling, and then his expression faltered. He looked at the table, then at me, then back at the table. "Mom? Where's Maria sitting?" Anna took a sip of her wine, her eyes glittering over the rim of the glass. "Oh, dear," she said, her voice dripping with faux concern. "Did the restaurant make a mistake?" I specifically told the mate. "I'll go ask the waiter," Alan said, starting to rise. "No, sit," Anna commanded, placing a hand on his arm. "You're the guest of honor. Let Maria go. Or better yet, Alan, why don't you go check on the wine list at the bar? They have that vintage you like." Alan hesitated, looking between us. The tension in the air was palpable, a stretched rubber band ready to snap. Okay, he said finally, opting for the path of least resistance as he always did. "I'll be right back." He squeezed my hand, a fleeting, apologetic touch, and walked away toward the bar. As soon as he was out of earshot, the atmosphere at the table shifted. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Anna set her glass down with a sharp clink. The smiles on the faces of the brothers vanished, replaced by looks of uncomfortable avoidance. Caroline and Smith kept their heads down, staring at their plates as if they contained the secrets of the universe. Anna turned to me. The mask of the doting mother was gone. In its place was the face I saw in my nightmares, cold, sneering, and utterly devoid of humanity. "You really don't get it, do you?" she said, her voice low and venomous. Standing there like a lost puppy. "It's pathetic." I clutched my bag tighter, feeling the hard edge of the recorder pressing against my ribs. "I don't know what you mean, Anna." "Don't play dumb," she snapped. "Look at this table. Look at us. We are family. Blood. History. And you? You are a temporary inconvenience. A stranger who clawed her way in." Her words were like physical blows, each one landing with precise, practiced cruelty. "I am Alan's wife," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts. "Wife," she scoffed, as if the word were a dirty joke. "A piece of paper doesn't make you family. Sacrifice makes you family. Loyalty makes you family. And you? You have done nothing but complain and whine and try to steal my son away from me." She leaned forward, her eyes boring into mine. "So, here is how tonight is going to go. Since you are so desperate to be part of this family, you are going to pay for it. Literally." I blinked, confused. "What?" "The bill," she hissed, gesturing to the lavish spread of appetizers and expensive wine bottles already cluttering the table. "This dinner? It's going to cost a fortune. And if you want a seat at this table, if you want me to stop whispering in Alan's ear every single day about what a mistake he made, you will pay for it. All of it." My breath hitched. "You want me to pay, for everyone?" "Consider it an entrance fee," she smiled, a cruel twisting of lips. "Show me you're sincere. Show me you know your place, which is serving this family. If you pay the bill, without complaint, I might consider tolerating you. I might even let you sit down." She leaned back, crossing her arms, looking like a judge delivering a verdict. "Or," she continued, her voice dropping to a whisper that carried across the silent table, "you can leave. Right now. Walk out that door and never show your face to me again. Go back to whatever hole you crawled out of and leave my son to people who actually care about him." The room spun. I looked at Caroline and Smith, hoping for someone, anyone, to speak up. Caroline looked up for a split second, her eyes filled with terror and apology, before quickly looking away. Smith was white-knuckled, gripping her napkin. They were hostages, just as terrified of her as I was. "Well?" Anna demanded, tapping her fingers on the table. "Tick-tock, Maria. Alan will be back any minute. Make your choice. Are you family? Or are you just an outsider passing through?" The ultimatum hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Pay for a meal I wasn't allowed to eat, for people who despised me, just to buy a temporary ceasefire? Or walk away and risk losing the man I loved? I looked at the empty space where my chair should have been. It wasn't just a missing piece of furniture, it was a symbol. There was no place for me here. There never had been. I was fighting for a seat at a table that had been rigged against me from the start. My hand tightened on my bag. The recorder was running. Every word, every drop of venom, was being captured. But as I looked at Anna's smug face, I realized that proof wasn't what I needed right now. I needed dignity. I took a deep breath, the scent of expensive lilies filling my nose, cloying and sweet like funeral flowers. The sadness that had been drowning me suddenly crystallized into something sharp and cold. I started, my voice barely a whisper. "Speak up." Anna barked. I looked her dead in the eye. For the first time, I didn't see a monster. I saw a sad, bitter old woman terrified of losing control. And I saw myself, a woman who had spent too long begging for scraps. "I have made my choice," I said, my voice steadying. And in that moment, as Alan's footsteps approached from behind me, I knew exactly what I had to do. The tragedy wasn't that I was leaving, the tragedy was that I had stayed this long. The silence that followed Anna's ultimatum was not empty, it was heavy, filled with the crushing weight of 1,000 unsaid apologies and the debris of my crumbling marriage. I stood there, clutching my purse with white-knuckled desperation, feeling the gaze of the entire table pressing against my skin like a physical bruise. The restaurant hummed around us, the clinking of silverware, the murmur of distant conversations, the soft jazz playing overhead, but in our small, gilded corner of the world, time had stopped. I looked at Anna, sitting there with her chin raised in imperious expectation, waiting for me to crumble. She expected tears. She expected begging. She expected me to open my wallet and purchase a sliver of her tolerance, to pay for the privilege of being insulted in front of the man I loved. But as I looked at her, and then at the empty space where my chair should have been, something inside me didn't break. It simply ceased. The frantic need to belong, the desperate clawing for acceptance that had defined my life for the past 3 years, evaporated. It was replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity. I was a stranger. She had said it herself. And strangers owe nothing to the people who despise them. I looked at Alan, who was just returning from the bar, a bottle of wine in his hand and a confused smile on his face. He saw me standing, saw the tension radiating from his mother, and faltered. In his eyes, I saw the hesitation that had broken my heart 100 times before. He wouldn't step in. He wouldn't ask why I was standing while everyone else sat. He would wait for the storm to pass, hoping to survive the wreckage rather than prevent it. That realization was the final severance of the tether that bound me to him. I was mourning him while he was still standing right in front of me. "I am a stranger," I said, my voice quiet but steady, cutting through the thick atmosphere like a blade. "And strangers do not pay for family dinners." The shock on Anna's face was almost comical, a fracture in her perfectly composed mask of cruelty. Her mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. She had scripted this moment, written the dialogue for a submissive daughter-in-law, and I had just burned the page. I didn't wait for her response. I didn't look at Alan to see the betrayal I knew would be etched on his face. I simply turned around. The movement felt slow, as if I were wading through deep water. Every step away from that table was a physical effort, a tearing away of roots that had grown deep into my soul. I was walking away from my husband, from the future we had planned, from the house in Greendale, from the children we would never have. I was walking into a void, terrifying and vast. As I passed the chairs where Caroline and Smith sat, I felt a magnetic pull, a shared frequency of sorrow. I glanced at them, just a fleeting look. Caroline, the eldest brother's wife, sat with her head bowed, her hands trembling in her lap. Smith, the youngest, looked up at me, her eyes wide and rimmed with red. In that brief exchange, a lifetime of shared pain passed between us. We were the collateral damage of this family, the quiet victims who absorbed the venom so our husbands could remain the favored sons. They saw me leaving, really leaving, and in my departure, they saw the reflection of their own cages. I kept walking, my heels clicking a lonely rhythm on the polished floor. I reached the edge of the dining room, the heavy velvet curtains looming ahead like the entrance to a new world. Then, I heard it. The scraping of a chair against the floorboards. It was a harsh, discordant sound that tore through the hush of the room. I stopped and turned back, my heart hammering against my ribs. Caroline was standing up. Her face was pale, drained of blood, but her jaw was set with a rigidity I had never seen in her. She looked down at her husband, a man who was currently staring at her with his mouth agape, a piece of bread halfway to his lips. She didn't say a word. She didn't scream or shout. She simply placed her napkin on the table, a white flag of surrender to the marriage, but a declaration of war against the misery. She picked up her purse, her movements deliberate and final. "Caroline," her husband hissed, his voice a mix of confusion and embarrassment. "What are you doing?" "Sit down." She didn't look at him. She looked at Anna, whose face had gone from shock to a purple-hued fury. Caroline's eyes were dead, the eyes of a woman who had nothing left to lose because everything had already been taken. She turned away from the table, her gaze locking onto mine across the room. She started walking. And then, another scrape. Smith stood up. She was shaking, her whole body vibrating with the terrifying adrenaline of rebellion. She was the youngest of us, the one who tried the hardest to please, the one who baked cookies and remembered birthdays and swallowed every insult with a smile. But seeing Caroline stand, seeing the impossible become possible, broke something in her too. She looked at her husband, who was busy typing on his phone under the table, oblivious to the emotional earthquake happening above him. She looked at the expensive food, the wine, the mother-in-law who ruled them with fear. Smith stood, took a deep, shuddering breath, and followed Caroline. The restaurant seemed to hold its collective breath. 3 women, 3 wives, 3 outsiders, walking away from the table that was supposed to define their worth. I watched them come toward me, leaving behind the men who had promised to cherish them but had only watched them bleed. The silence from the table behind them was deafening. No one chased them. No one yelled "Stop," or "I love you." The husbands sat frozen, paralyzed by their mother's presence, unable to choose their wives over the woman who held the purse strings of their emotional lives. When Caroline and Smith reached me, we didn't speak. There were no words for this kind of devastation. We were refugees fleeing a war zone, carrying nothing but the clothes on our backs and the shattered remains of our dignity. We walked out of the dining room together, a phalanx of sorrow, passing the maitre d' who looked at us with mild concern. We pushed through the heavy front doors and stepped out into the night. The air was cold, biting against my flushed skin, but it felt clean. It felt real. The opulent, suffocating perfume of the restaurant was replaced by the smell of exhaust and rain and city grit. We stood on the sidewalk, the 3 of us, shivering slightly in our evening dresses. The door swung shut behind us, sealing the tomb of our marriages. I looked at Caroline, and a single tear traced a path down her cheek, cutting through her foundation. Smith let out a sob, a raw, ugly sound that she quickly stifled with her hand. "I didn't think I could do it," Caroline whispered, her voice cracking. "I've wanted to leave for 5 years. But I couldn't move." "I was waiting for permission," Smith admitted, her voice barely audible over the traffic. "I think I was waiting for someone to tell me it was okay to stop trying." I reached out and took their hands. Their fingers were cold, but their grip was strong. We stood in a circle, a trinity of heartbreak, under the indifferent glow of the streetlights. We were alone. We had no plan, no money for the bills we left behind, no idea where we would sleep or how we would untangle the messy, painful knots of divorce. But as I looked at the closed doors of the Gilded Lily, I realized we had something far more valuable. We had our voices back. I squeezed their hands, feeling a strange, sad strength flowing between us. "We're strangers to them," I said softly, the tears finally spilling over, hot and fast. "But we don't have to be strangers to each other." We didn't look back. We couldn't. To look back would be to turn into pillars of salt, frozen in the act of longing for a life that had never really loved us. Instead, we turned toward the street, toward the unknown, walking away from the warmth of the restaurant and into the cold, dark, beautiful freedom of the night. Behind us, the family remained, locked in their golden cage, while we, the outcasts, finally learned how to fly. The night air outside the restaurant was crisp, but it did nothing to cool the burning sensation on my skin. I stood on the sidewalk, my breath hitching in my throat, a refugee from my own life. Caroline and Smith stood beside me, silent sentinels of our shared rebellion. We were 3 women who had just detonated our marriages, leaving behind the debris of shattered expectations and a dinner bill that loomed larger than our collective futures. We didn't speak. There was no need. The silence between us was a language of its own, woven from years of swallowed insults and unshed tears. Inside the Gilded Lily, however, the silence had shattered. Through the heavy glass doors, muffled shouts began to bleed into the street. It wasn't the polite murmur of dining conversation, it was the raw, jagged edge of chaos. I turned, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs, and saw the maitre d' frantically gesturing towards the back of the restaurant. Then, a crash. The sound of porcelain meeting floor with violent intent. It was a sound I knew too well, the sound of Anna losing control. My phone buzzed in my clutch, a frantic, insistent vibration. Alan. I ignored it. It buzzed again. And again. Then, a new number. A local landline. I stared at the screen, a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. Against my better judgment, against every instinct screaming at me to run, I answered. Is this Maria? A calm, authoritative voice. This is the manager at the Gilded Lily. There has been an incident. You need to return immediately. I left, I whispered, my voice trembling. I'm not part of that party anymore. Ma'am, the police have been called, the manager said, his tone brooking no argument. Your mother-in-law is currently being detained for destruction of property and refusal to pay. She is hysterical. She claims you are the one liable for the bill. The world tilted on its axis. Police. Anna, the woman who prided herself on her spotless reputation, the matriarch who looked down on everyone from her pedestal of superiority, was being arrested. A dark, twisted satisfaction coiled in my gut, quickly replaced by a wave of exhaustion. It wasn't over. It was never over with her. I'll be there, I said, hanging up. I looked at Caroline and Smith. They had heard enough. She did it, Caroline breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. She actually lost it. We walked back into the restaurant, not as guests this time, but as witnesses to a train wreck. The scene that greeted us was something out of a nightmare. The elegant dining room was in disarray. A table had been overturned, expensive wine pooling on the plush carpet like blood. Shards of crystal littered the floor, glittering under the chandeliers. And in the center of it all, held back by two uniformed officers, was Anna. She was unrecognizable. Her carefully coiffed hair was wild, strands escaping the pins to hang around her face like Medusa's snakes. Her face was a mask of contorted rage, red and blotchy, veins bulging in her neck as she screamed. She wasn't the composed, icy woman who sliced me with words, she was a feral animal cornered in a trap of her own making. She has to pay. It's her fault. She walked out on her family. Anna shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at me as I entered. Her voice was raw, scraping against the elegant surroundings like a rusty nail. Officer, arrest her. She's the one. She's the thief. Officer Johnson, a tall man with a weary expression that suggested he had seen too many family dramas unfold in public, stepped forward. He looked from the wreckage to me, then back to the screaming woman. Ma'am, he said to Anna, his voice calm but firm, you are the one who destroyed this property. You are the one who ordered the food. The restaurant holds the person who made the reservation responsible. I don't have the money. Anna wailed, her bravado crumbling into panicked sobs. My son was supposed to, where is he? Alan. Tell them. Tell them she has to pay. I looked at Alan. He was standing near the overturned table, looking smaller than I had ever seen him. His face was pale, his eyes darting between his mother and the police, terrified. He looked like a child lost in a supermarket, waiting for an adult to fix everything. But there were no adults here. Just broken people and the mess they had made. Alan, I said, my voice cutting through Anna's screams. What happened? He looked at me, misery etched into every line of his face. She didn't bring her wallet, he stammered, his voice barely a whisper. She thought I would pay. But my card, it declined. the limit, the move. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The gift of the dinner, the family celebration, it was all a lie. She never intended to pay. She intended to stick Alan with the bill, knowing he would stretch himself thin to please her. And when that failed, when I walked out and took my contribution with me, the house of cards collapsed. She started throwing things, Alan continued, looking at the broken vase near his feet. When the manager said he'd call the cops, she just snapped. She's sick, Caroline whispered beside me. She's actually sick. Officer Johnson approached me, notebook in hand. Ma'am, are you related to this woman? I'm her daughter-in-law, I said, the title tasting like ash in my mouth. But I left before any food was served. I am not responsible for this. She is. She is. Anna screamed, lunging forward, only to be restrained by the other officer. She's the outsider. She's the one who ruined everything. Make her pay. Seize her assets. Do something. The sheer venom in her voice, the unadulterated hatred, was breathtaking. Even in handcuffs, facing criminal charges, her only thought was to destroy me. She didn't care about the humiliation, the cost, the legal consequences. She only cared that I, the interloper, be punished. I looked at her, really looked at her, and for the first time I felt nothing. No fear. No anger. No pity. Just a vast, empty indifference. She was a tragedy I no longer wanted to watch. Officer, I said, turning my back on her screaming form. I have nothing to do with this debt. I didn't eat. I didn't drink. And I certainly didn't smash this restaurant to pieces. We'll need a statement, Johnson said, nodding sympathetically. But for now, we're taking her in. Disorderly conduct, destruction of property, theft of services. Taking me in? Anna screeched. You can't. I'm a mother. I'm a respectable woman. Alan. Do something. Don't let them take me. Alan took a step forward, his hand reaching out, but then he stopped. He looked at the wreckage. He looked at the police. He looked at me, standing tall and unmoving. And then, he looked at his mother, really seeing her, perhaps for the first time, not as a saint, but as the architect of his ruin. He didn't move. He didn't speak. He just stood there, tears streaming silently down his face, as the officers began to read Anna her rights. The click of the handcuffs was the loudest sound in the room, a final, definitive punctuation mark on the night. You're useless. Anna spat at him as they dragged her toward the door. All of you. Useless, ungrateful children. I hope you rot. Her screams faded as they led her out, leaving behind a silence that was deafening. The restaurant staff began to sweep up the glass. The other diners watched with morbid fascination. And there we stood, Maria, Caroline, Smith, and the three husbands who had failed us, in the ruins of a family dinner that had cost us everything. I looked at Alan one last time. He was slumped against a wall, head in his hands. I felt a pang of sorrow, sharp and deep, but I didn't go to him. I couldn't. I was no longer the woman who fixed his messes. I was the woman who survived them. Let's go, I said to Caroline and Smith. We walked out of the restaurant again, past the police cruiser with its flashing lights, past the spectacle of Anna kicking at the window. We walked into the night, leaving the chaos and the handcuffs behind, stepping into a future that was terrifyingly, wonderfully blank. The strobing blue and red lights of the police cruiser danced across the wet pavement, casting a rhythmic, spectral glow over the wreckage of my life. I stood on the sidewalk, a hollow shell of the woman who had walked into that restaurant hours ago, watching as the officers prepared to depart with the woman who had spent years systematically dismantling my spirit. The air was thick with the smell of damp asphalt and the sharp, metallic tang of an impending storm. It felt like a funeral, not for Anna, who was currently snarling behind a reinforced window, but for the version of me that still believed in us. Officer Johnson stood between us, his posture a testament to the weariness of a man who had spent his career mediating the slow-motion car crashes of the human heart. He looked at Alan, then at me, his eyes lingering with a heavy sort of pity that made me want to wither into the ground. He spoke of restitution, of the restaurant's willingness to drop the charges if the damages and the exorbitant bill were settled immediately. He spoke of family matters and discretion, but all I heard was the sound of a closing door. I turned to Alan. He looked like a ghost, his skin sallow under the harsh fluorescent street lamps, his eyes red-rimmed and darting. He was a man drowning in a shallow pool of his own making, still reaching for the hand that was currently trying to pull him under. I felt a surge of sorrow so profound it physically hurt to breathe. It was the kind of pain that feels like a cold blade sliding between your ribs, precise, agonizing, and final. I realized then that I was looking at a stranger wearing my husband's face. I didn't scream. I didn't cry out. My voice, when I finally spoke, was a low, brittle whisper that seemed to vanish into the night air. I told him that this was the end of the road. I gave him the choice I had rehearsed in the dark corners of my mind. I told him that if he reached into his pocket to pay for the chaos his mother had wrought, if he chose to validate her cruelty once again by cleaning up her mess, then he was choosing a life without me. I drew the line in the sand, knowing even as I did it that the tide was already coming in. I watched the internal struggle play out across his features, a frantic, pathetic war between the man he wanted to be and the boy she had raised him to remain. He looked toward the police car, where Anna's face was pressed against the glass, a distorted mask of entitlement and rage. She didn't have to say a word, her very existence was a command he had never learned to disobey. I saw the moment his spine crumbled. I saw the moment he decided that my heart was a price he was willing to pay to stop his mother from being inconvenienced by her own actions. The sound of his leather wallet opening was the loudest thing I have ever heard. It was the sound of a bond snapping, of a promise being retracted. I watched his trembling fingers pull out the plastic, the small, rectangular symbol of his surrender. He didn't look at me as he handed it to the officer. He couldn't. To look at me would be to acknowledge the murder he was committing. The tragedy wasn't that he loved her more, the tragedy was that he didn't love himself enough to be free. I didn't wait for him to finish. I didn't wait for the "I'm sorry" that I knew would eventually come, hollow and meaningless, once the adrenaline faded. I simply turned and began to walk. The journey home was a blur of gray streets and flickering neon signs. I walked with a strange, mechanical rhythm, my heels clicking against the sidewalk like a countdown. I felt light, as if the gravity of the past 3 years had suddenly been switched off, leaving me to drift into a cold, dark orbit. The city moved around me, taxis hooting, couples laughing as they left bars, the mundane pulse of a world that didn't know mine had just ended. I felt like a phantom, a glitch in the reality of the night, invisible to everyone including myself. When I reached our apartment, the silence that greeted me was suffocating. I stood in the doorway, staring at the furniture we had picked out together, the photos on the wall of a wedding day that felt like it belonged to a different century. This was the place where I had tried so hard to build a sanctuary, only to find I had been building a prison. I walked into the bedroom and pulled my large suitcase from the top of the closet. The sound of it hitting the floor was final, a heavy thud that echoed through the empty rooms. I began to pack, not with the frantic energy of anger, but with the cold, methodical precision of a survivor. I didn't take everything. I left the gifts he had bought me, the jewelry that felt like shackles, the clothes I had worn to dinners where I was silenced. I only took the things that belonged to the woman I used to be. Every shirt I folded, every pair of shoes I tucked into the corners, felt like a ritual of reclamation. I was stripping away the layers of wife and daughter-in-law until only the raw, wounded core of Maria remained. I came across a photograph of us from our first anniversary, tucked into the corner of the dresser mirror. We were on a beach, the sun setting behind us, our shadows long and intertwined. I looked at the girl in the photo, her eyes bright with a future that didn't exist, and I wept. I wept for the children we had named but would never hold. I wept for the house in Greendale that would remain a flyer in a trash can. I wept for the sheer, exhausting waste of it all. As I zipped the suitcase shut, the sound of the teeth locking together felt like the final stitches in a wound. I dragged the bag to the front door, the wheels rattling over the hardwood floors I had scrubbed so many times to appease a woman who couldn't be appeased. I looked back one last time at the living room. The brochures for the new houses were still on the coffee table, a cruel reminder of the fresh start that had been a lie from the beginning. I realized then that the stranger Anna had called me was actually a gift. To be a stranger to this family was to be clean. To be an outsider was to be whole. I was no longer the thorn or the victim, I was simply a woman standing at a door, holding a suitcase and a heavy heart, ready to step out into a world that was terrifyingly, beautifully silent. I took the spare key, the one that matched the one Anna used to invade my life, and I laid it on the counter. It looked small and insignificant, a piece of metal that had caused so much misery. I didn't leave a note. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been screamed into the void 1,000 times before. He had made his choice at the restaurant, and now, I was making mine. I stepped out into the hallway, the door clicking shut behind me with a soft, definitive sound. The elevator ride down felt like a descent from a high altitude, my ears popping as the pressure of the marriage finally released. As I walked out of the building and onto the street, the first drops of the storm began to fall, cold and sharp against my face. I welcomed them. They felt like a baptism, a washing away of the bleach and the perfume and the lies. I hailed a cab, the yellow car pulling up like a life raft in a dark sea. "Where to?" the driver asked, glancing at me in the rearview mirror. I looked out the window at the apartment I was leaving forever, the lights in the window still burning, waiting for a man who would return to an empty home. I felt a pang of devastating sadness for him, for the life he would lead in that stagnant orbit, but for the first time, I didn't feel responsible for it. "Anywhere," I whispered, my voice finally finding its strength. "Just drive." The ink on the divorce papers felt heavier than it looked. It was a strange, cold finality, a few strokes of a pen to dissolve years of shared breath, shared meals, and shared dreams that had long since curdled into nightmares. When I finally signed my name, Maria, for the last time as Alan's wife, I didn't feel the sudden burst of fireworks I had expected. Instead, I felt a profound, hollow ache, like a cavernous room that had just been emptied of all its furniture. It was the sound of a long, agonizing exhale after a lifetime of holding my breath. The air in the lawyer's office was sterile and smelled of old paper and dust, a far cry from the cloying, suffocating perfume of Anna's presence. I walked out into the sunlight, my hand trembling as I tucked my copy of the decree into my bag. It was my certificate of liberation, but it was also a death certificate for the woman I used to be. The months that followed were a slow, methodical reclamation of my own soul. I moved into a small studio apartment on the other side of the city, a place where the walls were bare and the silence was mine to fill. In those early weeks, the quiet was terrifying. I would find myself standing in the middle of the kitchen, waiting for an insult that never came, or checking the door a dozen times to ensure no one with a spare key could barge in. I had been conditioned to live in a state of perpetual ambush, and unlearning that fear was like trying to straighten a tree that had grown crooked against a constant wind. I spent many nights sitting on the floor of my new home, surrounded by unpacked boxes, weeping for the sheer exhaustion of having survived. But I wasn't surviving alone. The bond between Caroline, Smith, and me became the unexpected sanctuary in the wreckage. We met once a week in a quiet corner of a local park or a dimly lit cafe where the tea was warm and the judgment was non-existent. We were a trinity of survivors, each of us carrying the same invisible scars, the same stories of being the outsider. We didn't need to explain why we flinched at loud voices or why we felt guilty for buying a new pair of shoes without asking permission. We were mirrors for one another, reflecting back a dignity we had forgotten we possessed. During one of our rainy afternoon meetings, Smith shared news from the old neighborhood, the Kingdom of Anna, as we had come to call it. It was a story that should have brought me a sense of triumph, but instead, it filled me with a weary, poignant sadness. Alan and his 2 brothers had all moved back into Anna's house. Without us to manage the housework, the bills, the emotional labor, and the basic rhythms of a home, their individual lives had collapsed like houses of cards. They were men in their prime, yet they had retreated into the nursery of their mother's making, unable to boil an egg or fold a shirt without her direction. The neighborhood, once a place of whispers and averted eyes directed at us, had turned its gaze toward them. They had become a local curiosity, a museum of arrested development. People watched from behind their curtains as three grown men followed their mother to the grocery store, a phalanx of sons still tethered to an umbilical cord that should have been severed decades ago. They had chosen their mother over their wives, and in doing so, they had traded their futures for a stagnant, suffocating past. I thought of Alan, sitting in his childhood bedroom, perhaps staring at the same walls he looked at as a boy, and I felt a sharp, fleeting pang of mourning for the man he could have been if he had only been brave enough to love himself. They kept what they wanted, Caroline said that day, her voice sounding older, more resonant than I remembered. They kept her. And she kept them. It's the only victory they'll ever know.